Okay, you're live.
Okay, it's live now?
Yes.
All right. Then I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everybody that I can't see out there. My name is Alex Oxner, and I'm the Assistant Program Director for Inclusive Teaching at the University of Notre Dame. I've only been in this position for since July, so only for a couple of months. And I came to Notre Dame from Nashville State Community College, where I was a full-time English instructor last year, and I still adjunct there on the side because I just couldn't let go of the community college context. But I wanted to kind of offer this workshop that cobbles together a lot of the discussions that we've been having at Notre Dame over the past year, really, but especially within the last few months, with all of the politicization of language around COVID-19, the racial justice movements, the upcoming election, and these difficult conversations have been coming up a lot in the classroom. One of my duties at Notre Dame is to do individual consultations with faculty members. So this workshop is also drawing from my experience in the conversations that I've been having with instructors the last couple of months. I did want to briefly go over the workshop goals, and it's going to kind of unfold in two parts. The first is to understand the pedagogy behind microaggressions and unconscious bias, how we can help to mitigate those in our classrooms. But when they do come up, we can learn strategies for facilitating those difficult conversations, both when they happen in the moment, we're going to go over those strategies, but in the second half of this workshop, we're going to go over how we might prevent these difficult conversations from arising. An impossible task. It's not going to happen perfectly, and those conversations will come up. But I'm actually going to talk about anti-racism and decolonization as ways that we could think about inclusive teaching and how we might train our students and build a vocabulary for them so that they maybe don't bring up as many of these challenging conversations or commit as many microaggressions. So that's just the kind of overview for the workshop. Sorry, I'm new to this platform, so moving between slides is a little bit tricky. But I do want to just start by offering a brief definition of microaggressions. It's one that people have probably seen before from Sue, and it just says brief or everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to a target group. And of course, these can be intentional, but more importantly, they can be unintentional. Our students might not realize that they are committing microaggressions against others. In this Snapchat that I put on the right, it shows a student who took a Snapchat of a university classroom, and it says, taking Calc 151 with only Asians in the classroom. I hope I don't catch coronavirus. So this was something a student circulated at the beginning of this semester, and it was viral for obvious reasons. The racism behind it, the xenophobia, and also the idea that there's going to be issues building a community in this classroom. Sometimes as instructors, we don't know when our students are saying these things, right? We wouldn't necessarily see this Snapchat that they've circulated, but we can think through ways to mitigate these conversations and address these challenging issues when they happen in the classroom. I wanted to offer a little bit of the research on this issue, and I'm going to kind of filter it throughout this breakout session as well. But I wanted to think about how microaggressions or just unconscious bias play out at the institutional level first. So in this example, emails to faculty members were circulated from fictional prospective graduate students who applied to a university, and they were requesting future mentoring. Those emails were significantly more likely to get a reply if a stereotypically white male name was used in the email address, particularly when the faculty members worked in higher paying disciplines or at private institutions. And in the second example, from the institutional level, it involves a science faculty initiative. So science faculty from research-intensive universities were rating the application materials of a student, and this student was randomly assigned either a male name or a female name. And when faculty participants rated these applicants, the male applicants were rated significantly higher. They were more competent and hireable than the female applicant, even though the two applications were actually identical. These participants also selected a higher starting salary and offered more career mentoring to the male applicant. and the gender of the faculty member did not affect responses. So I wanted to call attention to those higher level structural concerns that we're going to get into a little bit more in the second half of this breakout session. But I do want to narrow it down and zoom in a bit now to the student perspective and student experience. This is a screenshot of an initiative. It's kind of happening all over the country at a lot of different institutions. It's just the I Too movement, but this one is specifically from my university. So it says, I too am Notre Dame, and it's a hashtag that's been going around social media. It's where students, particularly students of color, are owning their identities and publicizing the microaggressions that they have experienced. So in this example, the student has written on his hand a quote from something that was said to him. It says, "Will you be the thug in my student film?" So he was approached by a group of students, presumably white students, who needed a thug. And of course, he feels as if they gravitated towards him because of the racial biases in that statement. So we're going to talk about interrogating our own biases that we might have as instructors. And we're also going to talk about hunting assumptions, which is a framework that I'm borrowing from Stephen Brookfield. This is another example. The student is an Asian American, and she's holding a sign that says, "No, where are you really from?" Right? This is one of the most common microaggressions that I hear from my students in the classroom, especially on the first day when we're doing icebreakers and trying to introduce each other. But she's wearing a Rams hat, and she is clearly annoyed, right? She's annoyed by this microaggression. She's upset by it. So I wanted to just go through a couple of these assumptions. On the opening slide of this presentation, I gave a tinyurl link. It was tinyurl.com/challenging2020, and it will give you access to all these slides, so you could access these resources later. So I won't go into them in depth, but just a couple of them at the top are the most recent ones that I've been hearing. And it's the way that framework works, the way that Brookfield has kind of laid out the framework is what's said, so what's the microaggression, versus what is received by the victim or the person hearing the microaggression. So this is a really common one at the top. There's only one race, the human race. So that idea of color blindness, the idea that all lives matter, right? All these different iterations of racism. And what's received is that the person's difference is invisible or not important. It's not unique or worthy of attention. We'll do just one more, which is the second one. What's your name? Oh, I'll never remember how to pronounce that, right? So this is being received as learning this really integral piece of your identity. Something as important as your name is either too time consuming or just not worth it. And you should assimilate or create an English or American sounding name so that I'm more comfortable, so it sounds more familiar to me. So these are just a couple of examples to get us thinking. But I want to focus mostly on solutions. I think that a lot of us probably are familiar with microaggressions and have heard them before, but what's the difficult task is figuring out how do we actually react in the moment? How do we either intervene, prompt reflection, create some kind of conversation around the microaggression so that we can make it a teaching moment or a learning moment. And I like to do this through react versus reflect. Both are really good strategies, and you just have to kind of figure out which one is best for the particular situation that you experience. Do you need an immediate reaction or a delayed one? So we're going to go through those two options together. The first part is reacting in the moment. So leaning into that challenging discussion. And I bring this up because all of the research on this subject shows that it is best to do something, that you have to take some kind of action. And it can be in the moment or it can be something that happens a little bit later. But Houston and DiPietro show that from the student's perspective, it really is best to do something. Students often express gratitude when faculty acknowledged that something awful had occurred. And then following up on that, they also found students reported that just about anything was helpful, and they offer these two courses of action, either something large scale or small scale. So regardless of whether the instructor's response required little effort, such as asking for a minute of silence, or a great deal of effort, like incorporating that event into the lesson plan or topics for the course, all that mattered was that they did something in the moment so that the students felt acknowledged, they felt seen, and they felt like something was going to come out of this conversation. This research is a little bit focused on teaching in times of crisis more broadly. So that's why they reference an event. But these strategies can also dovetail into smaller conversations around smaller events in the classroom, like microaggressions or conversations, difficult or challenging conversations that arise and make students feel uncomfortable. So one framework we can think through for reacting in the moment is the action framework that you may have seen before. But I like to bring it up because this one requires a lot of practice. It is not easy to intervene in the moment when these conversations arise. So the action framework just kind of takes the acronym of that word, and you can start by asking clarifying questions. This will help you assist with really understanding the intention behind the comment. So whether or not it was intentional or not, you can kind of figure out those perspectives by asking clarifying questions. So you can say something like, I want to make sure that I understand what you were saying. Were you saying X, Y, or Z? So you kind of reframe it. And often when they hear the question or comment said back to them, the student will back down, or they'll realize some bias in it, some error in their line of thinking. And sometimes they'll be able to reflect on their comment a little bit more if they hear it framed back at them as a question. The second part is to carefully listen. And I like to think of this as coming from a space of curiosity rather than judgment, so that the students feel like a conversation can happen. So you can say something like, I noticed blah, blah, blah. As you know, these comments can come across in a certain way, and you listen to them and allow them to explain further while also telling them what you see. That kind of leads into the next part, the T, tell others what you observed as problematic, but state it in a factual way so that the student knows what has happened and that those comments won't be tolerated in the classroom. Impact exploration. Ask for or state yourself what the potential impact of such a statement might be. What might that action have on others? Own your own thought. So there's a little phrase started there. When I heard your comment, I thought XYZ. So again, kind of repeating things back to the student, but now through your own words. And then taking next steps. So requesting that appropriate action is taken. This is not an easy framework to kind of remember on the fly and bring into your classroom. But on the resources slide at the end of this workshop, there's a longer version of the action steps, and it offers little prompts that you can use. And so you could memorize a couple of them and keep them in your pocket. And I've had to use them several times, but it's helpful to have those starter sentences to kind of think through how you might take action in the moment. One of the directors at the Notre Dame Teaching Center where I work also prepared these kind of concrete responses that I thought were helpful. And we edited them a bit to think how they might work in various contexts. So again, you'll have access to these afterwards. I won't go through them all in detail, but these give you little intervention sentences that you might use. And at the third bullet point, it says, I think there's a lot to unpack in that statement. Could you explain your response further? This is the one I use the most. It does the kind of A part of the action framework, ask a clarifying question, and it also does the O, owning my own thoughts as the instructor. So I put STEM example here to remind myself to tell the student example because I thought that it was a useful way of using the action framework. When I was teaching at Nashville State, an assignment that I often give is, I call it a critical career exploration. So the students need to focus on a career that they might want to explore or pursue in the future, and they need to look at it and examine it critically. What issues or challenges might they face if they really do enter into that profession? And I had a female student who was working on becoming a STEM researcher. She wanted to work in the STEM field in some capacity. She hadn't really thought about it that in depth. And just like any of you, I think as instructors, I had them get into groups. We did a kind of think, pair, share. And the student was that student was paired with a male student who said that gender discrimination in STEM isn't real anymore. That's not a thing. That we've moved beyond those things. That it's not going to be an issue. And so Luckily, I didn't have to do a lot in that moment. My female student, immediately kind of came for him and voiced her opinion more strongly, showing the research she had done and clarifying her point of view and why she thought that that might be a challenge in her field. But I did come in and intervene as the instructor as well. And I did say, there's a lot for you to unpack in that statement. Could you do that work of kind of working through why you've responded to her in that way? And he couldn't. Once he tried to explain his response further and back his position, he hadn't done the research to kind of figure out why he had that perspective or why he was taking that stand. And so he backed down and he apologized, and we worked on it from there. It's not always going to work that neatly, but I do think a couple things happened in that example. The first is I challenged him to do some critical thinking. And the second is I had built a curriculum, I think, where my female student also felt comfortable challenging him. And that's where more of the anti-racist or decolonialist work comes in a little bit that we'll get to in a moment. So if we're not going to react in the moment and we want to do a reflective mode instead, I just wanted to provide a couple of examples of how you might build in intentional time for students to contemplate on the action or the comment that was made. And so the first thing you could do is a discussion board, probably something that will happen outside of class. So if a comment is made during class time, there's a couple of reasons why you might want to do some reflection instead of reacting in the moment. The first is if students have time to if they have time to reflect, then they might be able to think a little bit more critically, prepare a better response, do a little bit of research on their position. And the second reason you might want to build in some reflection, why you might want to distance yourself from the comment in the moment, is because the student who received the microaggression or the comment or whatever it is might not want to talk about it, right? They might not want to have a prolonged discussion in front of others or in front of their instructor. So you could have them address this situation in a discussion board or other forum outside of class. And you can also decide if you would want that to be anonymous. You could do it in class, so there would still be time for them to reflect, but they would do it through some kind of free write or a minute paper. You could do some kind of additional assigned reading with an accompanying reflection. So maybe you assign an extra reading on the topic and then have them do a discussion board afterwards where they reflect on that. You could do activities that make them get into another person's shoes. If you Google that phrase online, you can find some activities. And then the last one you can do that's maybe more effective but takes up a little bit more time is to have them do a little bit of research or find a current event surrounding the issue that they could share or post about on a blog, do a little bit of work looking at historical context. And so if you want to access these slides later, that link that says historical context on this slide will bring you to a teaching tolerance article where I got the Snapchat from earlier in this workshop. And what I liked about it was that they saw the student make the comment, right? The kind of racist comment about Asian American students in the classroom and how they might catch coronavirus. So they saw that racist comment and they said, what we might do in this situation is give students some historical context. And they had a list of articles about why you shouldn't say the Chinese virus, why you shouldn't say that Asians are more likely to give you the coronavirus than other people, and all these kinds of articles around that context. So these are all ways that you could get students to reflect if you want to go into it a little bit more deeply. But the most important takeaways of this section, the kind of student-focused microaggression section, is to think about taking action in the moment. As I said earlier with that research, that is the most important thing. Take action somehow, whether it's in the moment or through reflection. Challenge the comment directly, acknowledge who is receiving the comment, acknowledge their feelings, and then respond with facts and equip students with language. We're going to get into that last bullet point now, equipping students with the language to use in future discussions. I think it's not news to anybody that this is work that should happen from the very first day of class. So because this is a short workshop, I'm only going to be talking about decolonizing the curriculum in relation to the syllabus. It's the first document that students see. Oftentimes they even look at it before the semester, uploaded it to Brightspace or Canvas or whatever your LMS is. And so they read through this document and it's a kind of contract between you and your students. So I do think it's important to think about how we might begin our anti-racist or decolonizing pedagogy by thinking through our syllabus. Anti-racism is not a new concept, so there's lots of different definitions circulating around it now. It is becoming increasingly popular in pedagogy circles, but I wanted to just create one definition that we could kind of focus on for this session. And I'm borrowing it from Ibram Kendi, who's become one of the major voices on this subject. And he has what I think is a really great and straightforward definition of anti-racism, where he says, one either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There's no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. So pretty stark, right? He's saying that if we're not actively taking a stand against racism, then we cannot be an anti-racist. I wanted to zoom this into teaching and pedagogy specifically, and I really liked the definition from Brown University. They say that anti-racist teaching specifically is intentional syllabus design, class content, or pedagogy that creates or develops racial equity. And they say this can work face-to-face and online. I like this definition because a lot of people, as I'm going to be doing here, focus only on the syllabus, right? For the sake of time, I have to focus on just one thing. But it also goes beyond that. It's not just about creating a syllabus with diverse text selection or something like that, even though that's what we're going to be focusing on. It goes beyond that to your pedagogy. How do you present yourself to your students? How do you design lessons? How do you deliver content to your students? And so it goes into the kinds of everyday interactions that you have with your students. A couple of challenges. A recent study, so Vanderbilt, some of the instructors at Vanderbilt were teaching courses related to subjects on race, racism, and social justice. And they were taking anti-racist pedagogical approaches in those classes. And they found 5 common challenges when they were introducing these subjects to their students. The first challenge was ahistorical or asocial ideologies. So students who thought that, yes, racism is still around, but that's only the problem of a few bad people, right? That's the people who are in the KKK or the Proud Boys or whatever it is, right? That yes, racism is around, but it's not a widespread issue. The second thing they encountered was students who thought either that discussions of race were only going to benefit white students, right? The ones who needed to learn about these issues or hadn't experienced them firsthand, or the issue that these subjects would only relate to students of color, that they'd be lost on any other type of student. So students had those misconceptions. The third was post-racial beliefs. So thinking that racism is a thing of the past. It's not that only a few individuals are still racist, but that racism is done. They found resistance to faculty authority. So the idea that the instructors didn't have the authority to talk about race in the classroom. This is an obvious issue at Vanderbilt where, like me, a lot of the teachers are white and they're talking about race, right? So that's an issue of authority for students. And then difficult multiracial dialogues. So when they did bring anti-racist approaches into the classroom or centered conversations around racism and social justice, some students took up these topics in ways that led to microaggressions. So those are some challenges. This is not an easy curriculum to implement, but there's a ton of benefits for students and for faculty. So just a couple pieces of research here from recent studies on anti-racist teaching. The first says that when students of color experience cross-racial dialogues in the classroom, it improves their cognitive development and their self-confidence, right? This shouldn't be a surprise that when students feel like cross-racial dialogues are valued and that their perspectives and identities are centered in the classroom, it makes them feel more confident. It gives them a self-esteem boost and help them perform better in the classroom. Anti-racist pedagogy can also help faculty. It helps them understand the impact of race on opportunity, and therefore they can examine the unconscious biases that they might be applying to their own students. So it can help them assess their teaching methods and their assessment methods if they can understand these different stereotypes and correlations between race and opportunity. And then just one more, which I think is a really important one. Students' openness to diversity after college is associated with the frequency that instructors include diverse perspectives in their courses. Again, it shouldn't be a surprise that if students are exposed to these ideas during their college careers, they'll bring those outside and beyond their college or university experience. So zooming in just a little bit more, decolonizing the curriculum and anti-racism are slightly different things, and I realize I'm kind of conflating them in this presentation. But I did want to offer a brief definition of decolonizing the curriculum. I'm borrowing it from Keele University. And they say that decolonization involves identifying colonial systems, structures, and relationships, and working to challenge those systems. And they're really pushing against the token inclusion, right? The idea of having just 1 week where you focus your course on the Harlem Renaissance, or 1 week where you focus on Black poets or something like that. So they really want you to integrate these voices and perspectives throughout your course. And they say that instead of tokenizing or including non-white cultures in a small way, we need to rather think of it as a culture shift, to think more widely about why common knowledge is what it is. And in doing so, we can adjust cultural perceptions and power relations. A couple of important considerations, though. We don't want to turn decolonization into a metaphor. We don't want it to lose its historical and social reality behind it and what this term actually means. And there's a really great article linked there by Tuck and Wang about using decolonization carefully as a term. And then we also want to confront our own privileges and consider whether or not this term, decolonizing the curriculum, is the best term for what we're doing in our classrooms. Appleton suggests a couple of alternatives. The one that I've adopted now is decentering, because I don't know if I'm doing enough structural work to call it decolonizing. So you can think about the different terms that are circulating in pedagogy circles as well. But in general, here's a couple of practical strategies for decolonizing the classroom. And they just look a lot, honestly, like being an inclusive pedagogy leader, being an inclusive teacher. So diversify your materials and your content. What texts do you assign to students? Not only creative texts, but also the research that you use. If you don't teach in the humanities discipline, what kinds of researchers are you focalizing in your course? Teach to learning outcomes that address power and social justice. So you can create learning outcomes in your syllabus that address those issues. Design assessments that allow diverse students to demonstrate mastery in diverse ways, right? So making sure that there's a variety of assessment strategies, both low stakes and high stakes throughout the course. Involve students in the creation of knowledge, content, and curriculum. We're going to see an example of this in a moment, but basically we really do want to make sure that students are helping to produce the course and design it in some ways. So this could be something as simple as allowing them to co-create a rubric with you for major assignments. It could be something like allowing them to contribute to the text selection process by bringing in their own texts. It could be allowing them to do presentations where they're leaders of the class for certain days. So involve them in that creation of knowledge. Embrace diverse language usage and interactions, writing, and tests. This is a big issue, especially if you have international students or English language learners. How can you build in tasks that allow them to use either their home language or the language that they're comfortable with, so that they feel that sense of belonging through their language? And then this is the one that Kendi really advocates for, right? That you need to move beyond just the classroom and involve yourself at the institutional, local, state, and national levels to advocate for this kind of equity. So I'm going to look at just one example of what this might look like, decolonizing the curriculum. And again, we're just going to be focusing a little bit on the syllabus and specifically the text section of the syllabus. So your texts that you ask students to read, whether it be research, articles, periodicals, short stories, whatever it is, you should be interrogating how you've selected your texts. So a couple of things. Discussion of race or people of color should not be additive. So it shouldn't be a topic that only happens once in the semester or in only one unit of the semester. So it shouldn't be additive or tokenized, but should instead be integrated throughout your curriculum throughout the semester. The second bullet says an anti-racist approach will also be mindful of the balance between deficit and asset-based depictions of communities. This one's becoming a lot more important and talked about. So it's based around the idea that when instructors do incorporate texts by people of color or from diverse backgrounds, they tend to only choose the kinds of texts that make it seem like those communities only have poor people or lower class people. So for instance, if you're teaching a course, you need to make sure that you're also showing people of color as knowledge makers, as thinkers, as experts. Produce texts from people of color from the middle and upper classes. Make sure that you're not just showing deficit communities when you're depicting people of color or diverse backgrounds. And then let your students contribute to the text selection process itself. And I have an example of that in the notes section of this slide that you could access later. But it was from a faculty member at Brown University, and he was teaching an art class. And he wrote a really nice article about involving students in the text selection process because he taught, I think the class was called History of Art and Architecture or something like that. And it was a pretty white field, and he realized that the canon of his discipline was pretty white. So what he did was allow students, or actually he asked students to identify a piece of art that represented an artist or a theme or a community or a tradition that they felt, the student felt, had been left out of the course or excluded. And as he built new iterations of the course each semester, he would incorporate those new pieces. So he was asking students to do the work of diversifying the texts for him, but it also allowed them to be knowledge makers in the classroom and to contribute to the development of the curriculum. So just one more example I've put at the top. What might this look like if you are, what might decolonizing the curriculum look like if you're in a field that doesn't invite these conversations? If you're not in the humanities or the social sciences, let's say that you're in a science course or a biology course or something like that, and you think, well, this conversation doesn't really apply to me because either the canon of my field is white and I can't do anything about that, or these conversations just don't come up in the research in my field, something like that. What you could do if you don't have a diverse range of texts to present to students, what you could do instead is include in your syllabus some kind of acknowledgement of the limits of your discipline or of research in your field. And I have one example here. It's a little bit long, so I've kind of broken it into 3 parts. I think this one was also from a Brown professor. They just had a really good set of examples, so I borrowed a lot of theirs. But it says, in an ideal world, science would be objective. However, much of science is subjective and is historically built on a small subset of privileged voices. And they go on to say that the readings of this course are authored by white men, that the course focuses on experiments that were also conducted by white men. They say that the course was recently edited by people who don't identify as white men, but that there's still biases in the curriculum. And then they say that integrating a diverse set of experiences is important for a comprehensive understanding of science. So please send suggestions my way, right? So what I really like about this statement is it doesn't seem like it would do a lot, but to a student who's reading this, who's a student of color or a female student or whoever they may be, this shows that the teacher is really intentional and understands the gaps and limitations, and that they still value other perspectives, even if they aren't presenting those perspectives in class. So what does this have to do with difficult conversations, right? The topic of this breakout session. I did want to think about this anti-racist or decolonial framework because I feel like a lot of the times when I attend workshops on microaggressions or challenging conversations, they focus a lot on what to do in the moment or how to get students to reflect. And I think that's really important. But I also think that these preventative measures are important too. Building our curriculum in a way where students feel like they belong can help reduce some of those challenges. So if we build our curriculums in these ways, it can potentially reduce students' exposure to traumatic dialogues or degrading comments because it provides students with models for how they can discuss these challenging situations. It sets community standards by showing that the instructor cares about these perspectives and these voices. It generates a sense of belonging for students, and it demonstrates that you want to gain their trust. So it really is all wrapped up in how we handle these conversations, because from the very first day when we're going over the syllabus, we're going over these policies where we show that we care about inclusion and that we want to represent diverse voices in our classrooms. So I wanted to do a couple of final considerations, and I think we'll have plenty of time. Yeah, we'll have plenty of time for some questions if any have come up in the chat. I don't know, I think I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I've had these little threads weaving throughout and these little strings of yarn. A student suggested this theme to me. We were just having a conversation about PowerPoints, and she in this discussion, and she recommended this kind of string thread thing, so I took it from her. But I liked the idea of weaving things together, and string and yarn are, once you thread them together, they can create a product at the end. Alice Walker's short story Everyday Use features quilts, and in that short story, she specifically talks about, I think the pattern's called the Lone Star, and so I've represented that here. And in a lot of places and a lot of traditions and communities, the Lone Star quilt is given as a gift, and it's used to kind of remember people in death and at funerals and things like that. So it's this kind of weird balance between giving and creating, and I just kind of liked ending with that note that my student has suggested. But when we're thinking through these really difficult conversations and challenges, I do want to invite you to consider the benefits of reacting versus reflecting, and to think intentionally about which approach you might take. But regardless, you should take some kind of action. Again, that's what students are going to be looking for the most from you as the instructor. Design a course that teaches students how to respond. So give them the skills to manage these conversations and the vocabulary for how to address these challenging topics. And then engage in self-reflection on your own through anti-racist practices and decolonizing your curriculum. This link brings you to Wheaton College's really good list of anti-racist practices that you can implement pretty easily in your own class. And then on this last slide with resources at the very bottom, it says there's a working checklist for decolonizing your syllabus. That's one that I'm currently creating, and it has all of the things we just talked about with diversifying your text selection, but in greater detail. And it goes over other parts of the syllabus as well and how you might decolonize it. That is all that I have, and I'd like to know if there's any questions in the chat. I'm not sure how to see the chat, or
there aren't any yet, but if anyone wants to put any questions in the chat, we'll see them filter through.
Okay, great. Yeah, then I invite any questions that folks might have to pop those into the chat.
Wanted to ask how we can get the slides. So I have, actually, do you want to go ahead and share a link to your slides? You were going to do that earlier. You shared the link to me.
Yeah, it's on the first slide, so I'll just go back to that.
Yeah, and if not, if you can't access them on here, we'll have a copy of her slides after the conference.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's just this tiny URL link that's listed there on the opening slide.
Okay. Karen says, you've presented many useful ideas. This presentation has been full of quote unquote meat. So no question, but a comment there.
Thank you.
You mentioned that some students may challenge the authority of the faculty to talk about race. How do you deal with those conversations if you've ever experienced them?
So I've not experienced those situations personally, but the faculty members that I've consulted with who have, it does seem like framing is really important. So if you're going to be addressing issues of race or racism or social justice in your classrooms, then you need to be really intentional with how you introduce those subjects. And that can start from the very first day of class. If you wanted to introduce some kind of state inclusion statement in your syllabus, or one like the example I showed from the science instructor, right, where you're basically acknowledging that you might not be the best person to have these conversations or to lead these discussions from experience, but that you still recognize the value of them. So you can do that on the first day through the syllabus. And I think most of the faculty who have encountered issues of authority hadn't actually built those into their community standards for their courses. So they hadn't done that work on the structural level of the course. But then in the moment, I think some of those instructors, once they were challenged, they really felt that lack of authority, right? So they kind of backed down. And I think what you could do instead in those moments is say, well, this isn't my lived experience, but it's still really important that we talk about these conversations, or that we have these conversations and talk about these subjects, because they're really integral to the subject. And then to just reinforce why you're having these conversations. How do they link to your course content, or to the reading assignment, and just kind of redirect it back to the course.
Jill has asked, what do you recommend in situations when students deny facts such as statistical data or other scientific research related to equity?
That has happened to me. And I don't know if I have the best answer for it, but what I've done is send them, I approach that on a more individual level. So that's a reflective moment where I approach that student individually, usually through email rather than in person. And I send them a list of resources or research that show why I've stated something or what the statistics are. And then I invite them at the end of that email to counter it and to say why they think that this research might be inaccurate, or how they might challenge it. And I don't think I've ever had a student challenge it once I send them at least 3 or 4 resources. The most recent example I can think of that is I was teaching a composition course, a writing course, and I sent him 3 or 4 resources, and he emailed me back and apologized and said that he hadn't really done his research. So it kind of gets at that the A part of the action framework of like asking clarifying questions, and then providing some research of your own.
Okay, there's no other questions at this time. We'll give it just a few more seconds. Yep, I'm not seeing any other questions. So.
Great.
Several thank yous. So thank you all for attending. Do you want any closing remarks, Dr. Oxner?
Just that you're welcome to access these slides, and if you have any questions, my email is there, and I'm happy to send you additional resources on any of these subjects, or to just answer questions that you might have that come up later.
Wanda says this is one of the best sessions I've seen on the topic. Very helpful, and thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, we will stop the broadcast. Thank you all.